It started as a stupid dare. My friends and I had been hanging out on a Friday night with nothing better to do. One of them, Jake, suggested we check out the old cemetery just outside of town. Everyone had heard stories about it. Missing gravestones, eerie whispers at night, and some saying they saw figures moving between the headstones. "Come on, it's just a cemetery," Jake said, grinning. "What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. The plan was simple. We'd sneak in, walk around, and see who could last the longest before chickening out. We parked a little way down the road to avoid drawing attention, climbed the rusty fence, and started making our way through the rows of gravestones. At first, it was just jokes and nervous laughter. The place was silent except for the occasional sound of the wind rustling the trees. But as we went deeper, the mood shifted. The air felt heavier, and even Jake stopped joking around. "That's when we saw it. A single candle burning near one of the graves. None of us had brought anything like that, and there was no one else in sight." Jake, being Jake, walked over to it. "Someone must have left it here earlier," he said, trying to sound unfazed. He leaned down to blow it out. The moment he did, everything changed. The air turned ice cold, and we all froze as a low, guttural sound echoed around us. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't an animal. It sounded like breathing, but deep and unnatural. We couldn't figure out where it was coming from. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaking. The others nodded, and we turned back toward the fence. That's when we noticed something strange. The headstones we had passed earlier were gone. The path we'd taken seemed to have shifted, like the cemetery was rearranging itself. Panic set in, and we started walking faster, calling out to each other to stay close. Then Jake stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed ahead, his hand trembling. Standing a few yards away was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, barely visible in the moonlight. "Oh!" Jake called, his voice cracking. No response. Another figure appeared behind the first, then another, and another. They seemed to come out of nowhere, all standing perfectly still, blocking our path. We turned and ran in the opposite direction, but it was no use. No matter where we went, the figures were there, watching us. They didn't move, but they were always ahead of us, like they were herding us somewhere. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing. At the center was the same grave where the candle had been. Now the flame was burning again, brighter than before. Jake whispered, "This isn't possible." The figures surrounded us, closing in. The breathing sound grew louder, and I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. I shut my eyes, waiting for whatever was going to happen. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. We were all lying in the clearing, the candle gone, the figures nowhere in sight. None of us spoke as we climbed over the fence and headed back to the car. We didn't talk about it afterward either. It was like we all silently agreed to forget it ever happened. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and hear that same low breathing. And I can't help but wonder if we left something behind, or if something followed us home. It started as a quiet night. I had recently picked up a part-time job as a night security guard at the old cemetery on the edge of town. The pay was decent, and I figured it'd be an easy gig. All I had to do was patrol the grounds a couple of times, make sure no one was trespassing, and then sit in the small office until my shift was over. The cemetery wasn't big, and most nights nothing ever happened. A few stray cats, maybe a gust of wind knocking over some flowers, that was the extent of the excitement. But one night, something felt off. Around 1 a.m. I decided to do my usual patrol. The air was eerily still. Not even the usual sound of distant traffic or rustling leaves. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. As I walked between the headstones, my flashlight caught something strange. A fresh bouquet of flowers lying on a grave that I knew hadn't been there earlier. I thought maybe a family member had stopped by before the gates closed, but the flowers were soaking wet, as if they'd just been placed. The grave itself belonged to someone who had passed away decades ago. I made a mental note to check the security footage later and continued my patrol. When I returned to the office, the door was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before leaving. My heart sank, but I told myself it was probably just the wind. Inside, everything seemed normal, except for one thing. My clipboard, which I'd left on the desk, was now on the floor. A single page had been torn out and was lying next to it. The page was blank except for one word scrawled across it: leave. I was shaken, but I convinced myself it was some prank. Maybe someone had snuck in while I was on patrol. I decided to review the security footage right away. The footage showed me locking the office door and heading out for my patrol just as I remembered. But about 5 minutes after I left, the screen flickered. When it stabilized, the office door was open and the clipboard was already on the floor. No one had entered, no one had left. It was as if the door had opened on its own and the clipboard had fallen without anyone touching it. I was tempted to leave right then and there, but I needed this job. I convinced myself it was just a glitch in the camera or something I'd somehow overlooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to finish my shift outside, away from the office. I sat on a bench near the entrance, flashlight in hand, counting down the hours until sunrise. That's when I noticed something in the distance. A faint glow coming from the same grave where I'd found the wet flowers earlier. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. As I approached, I saw a candle burning at the foot of the grave. There was no one around and no sign of how it had been lit. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down to inspect it, and that's when I saw the name engraved on the headstone. My blood ran cold. Michael Grant was my grandfather's name. He was still alive, or at least he had been when I started my shift that night. I stood there frozen, staring at the headstone, when I heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. "You shouldn't be here." I ran back to the office, grabbed my keys, and drove home as fast as I could. When I got there, I called my mom, desperate to make sure everything was okay. She answered, groggy but fine. My grandfather was asleep in the next room. I didn't go back to the cemetery after that. I called the manager the next morning and quit. A week later, I read in the paper that the cemetery was being closed for good, after multiple reports of strange activity. The article mentioned that it had been built over an older burial ground, long forgotten. I don't know what I saw that night or why my grandfather's name was on that grave, but I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in another cemetery again. A couple of years ago, I worked part-time for a landscaping company that took care of several cemeteries around the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. Most of the work involved trimming grass, planting flowers, or fixing up old headstones. One of the cemeteries on our route, Elmwood Cemetery, always gave me an uneasy feeling. It was older than the others and hadn't been maintained as well, with broken headstones and areas overgrown with weeds. One day, my supervisor asked me to stay late to clear some debris near the edge of the cemetery, an area we rarely touched. It was already late afternoon, and I wasn't thrilled about being there alone as the sun went down. Still, I agreed, thinking it would be a quick job. As I worked, I came across something unusual. Among the weeds and fallen branches, there was a patch of dirt that looked freshly disturbed. It wasn't marked with a headstone, which struck me as odd. I assumed it was just the ground shifting or animals digging, but the more I looked at it, the more deliberate it seemed. There were faint outlines, almost like a shallow grave had been dug recently. I felt uneasy, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I finished my work quickly and left, eager to get home. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the disturbed dirt from my mind. I told myself it was nothing, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The next day at work, I casually mentioned it to my supervisor. He went pale. He told me that area of the cemetery was supposed to be unused and had been for decades. He said he'd look into it, but told me to stay away from that spot for now. A week later, I found myself back at Elmwood Cemetery for another job. This time, I noticed something even stranger. The disturbed patch of dirt was gone. It had been filled in and smoothed over like nothing had ever been there. But now, there was an old wooden stake sticking out of the ground with no name or markings on it. It felt like whoever had disturbed the ground didn't want it to be noticed anymore. That night I had a dream, or maybe it was something else. I saw myself standing in the cemetery, staring at the same spot. There was someone behind me, though I couldn't see their face. They whispered something I couldn't understand, and when I turned around, they were gone. I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day, I decided to confront my supervisor. I wanted answers. He seemed reluctant to talk at first, but after some prodding, he admitted that there had been rumors about that area of the cemetery for years. He said workers had reported strange occurrences, like tools going missing or unexplained cold spots, and that some believed it was connected to unmarked graves from the cemetery's early days. I asked him if he thought the disturbed patch was one of those graves, but he didn't answer. Instead, he told me something that stuck with me. Some things are better left alone. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. That evening I went back to Elmwood Cemetery on my own against my better judgment. I needed to see that spot one last time. When I arrived, the cemetery was eerily quiet, and the area around the unmarked grave felt different, heavier almost. As I stood there, I heard it again, the faint whisper from my dream. This time I understood the words. You weren't supposed to see this. I left this cemetery and never went back. A month later, I quit my job. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that day, and honestly, I don't want to. Whatever it wasn't meant to be found.